Most of my students are going to present stuff that relates to Canadian projects we have, and so that gave me the opportunity to talk about a project or a collaboration that I've done with some of my Swiss colleagues. And the questions we were after was, do avalanche airbags lead to riskier choices in the backcountry? Avalanches have been here for a while. No, avalanche airbags have been here for a while, and they've pretty much established themselves as a useful additional avalanche safety tool. I've done a few studies where we looked at the effectiveness of airbags, and they seem to be certainly effective in reducing mortality if you actually pull the airbag when you're involved in an avalanche. But there's this nagging question whether the use of airbags would actually potentially lead to more riskier choices when people are in the backcountry. So basically, whether that positive effect from having an airbag is undermined by people skiing or snowmobiling slopes that they would otherwise not choose to. This concept is well established in the risk literature. It's called risk compensation or risk homeostasis, and it has been studied quite a bit in the risk field. The idea of looking at this with respect to airbags is also not new. There's actually been 3 ISSW papers that has looked at that. One by Nicholas Falcon in 2014, and then 2, one by Marengo and colleagues, and one by Terry Island in the 2016 ISSW. Without going into the details, the first 2 papers compared airbag owners or users with non-airbag users. While this comparison can provide useful insights, it actually doesn't show risk compensation, because these are just 2 different populations that we have in our community. To properly prove risk compensation, you have to look at the behavior of an individual both with and without airbags and look at the differences between those 2. And that's what Terry Island did. He did a survey where he provided participants with a slope scenario where he asked them to rate on a scale from 1 to 10, what's the acceptable hazard where you would still enter the slope. He had people sort of assess a base situation, and then he changed that situation slightly. And one of those changes was that he gave people an airbag and said, okay, you have an airbag and an avalanche now. What's your acceptable hazard now? And he was able to show that for about a quarter of participants, they actually had a higher threshold than without the airbag. And so his conclusion was that there was some indication of risk compensation here. Now, he only included a single slope scenario in his study, and so we thought, okay, it's kind of hard from a single slope scenario to really extrapolate to the whole population, so we wanted to have a little bit more of a comprehensive perspective on the topic. So that was really sort of our objective of the study. So we were sort of after these 5 questions. What are the differences between owners of airbags and non-owners? What are people's reasons for buying airbags or not buying them? Do people think themselves that it would actually affect their behavior? And then let's see whether it actually does affect their terrain choices. And last but not least, do airbags affect people's involvement frequency? Now, most of these questions are like perfect for a survey. The 4th one here is a little bit more challenging. And I really tried, but unfortunately, the university doesn't let me do a proper experiment out in the field with this. So we had to sort of resort to some other method to look at this. And what we used was a discrete choice experiment, and many of you have seen these type of experiments in the past because I've used them quite frequently in a number of surveys. What they do is basically you put survey participants into hypothetical but realistic decision scenarios where you give them multiple choices. In our case, it was 2 out-of-bounds ski run choices. And you ask, which are both characterized by a number of different variables. In our case, it was slope steepness, the type of slope, so whether it was treed or a gully. We also had open slopes. We gave them the size of the slope, and then we told them how often those slopes are skied and whether they can see any tracks on it. And so the task was basically, we gave them a local danger rating, and then we said, of those two slopes that you're presented with, which of one would you feel comfortable with? And there was also the option that they could choose not to go out of bounds on that particular day at all. We had 44 of those different scenarios, and they were built based on a statistical design in the background, which allows us to then actually identify in the analysis how important some of these variables are for their choices. So in a survey, you normally give people multiple of these scenarios to choose from. And so our experimental setup was that for both owners and non-owners of airbags, we gave them first, actually 4, not 3. It's a long story where there's 3 on the slide and not 4, but we gave them 4 normal scenarios, said under normal circumstances, in these 4 scenarios, choose your preferred slope, and one of these, we had like 1 for low, 1 for moderate, 1 for considerable, and 1 for high, so that we will cover the whole range of the danger ratings. And then we said, for the participants who didn't own an airbag, we said, now we give you an airbag. And for the rest of the experiment, you will think of yourself as you would be wearing an airbag. For the airbag owners, we said, your airbag is broken right now, so we'll take it away from you. Make those choices for the remainder of the experiment without the airbag in mind. So that was the experimental setup. And the nice thing here is that we can do a number of comparisons. We can compare owners with non-owners, and we can compare the normal and the abnormal situation for both the owners and the non-owners. If there was risk compensation, we would expect more aggressive choices over here, and we would expect more conservative choices there. So that was the experimental setup. So the survey was done in the spring of 2017 in Switzerland. We had about 400 participants. This just sort of highlights the main sort of socio-demographics that we had. 70% male, sort of between 25 and 44, mostly Swiss and German. There was a slight preference for out-of-bounds skiing, and overall the sample was fairly experienced. So 37% of the backcountry skiers and 42% of the out-of-bounds skiers had more than 10 years of experience. You also see that in the training courses here. We had about half of them had formal avalanche training. 16% were group leaders in the Alpine Club, and then we actually also had some mountain guides. Based on some risk attitude questions, we also grouped participants into 3 different sort of risk attitude clusters. So we had sort of thrill seekers, then we had powder seekers that were kind of less interested in just risk, they were really primarily interested in powder, and then we had sort of almost half of the sample was these conservative skiers. Okay, so that was the sample. Out of this, about 40% of our sample was airbag owners. And so this here highlights the comparison between the owners and non-owners of airbags. So airbags were more male, higher percentage of out-of-bounds skiers, and they were more committed to the sport. They were more experienced, had more training, generally spent more time out in the backcountry. And this generally sort of confirmed the results of earlier studies. Airbag owners are generally more committed, and they just simply spend more time out in the backcountry. Interesting though, there was no difference in the risk attitude membership, and there was no difference in the avalanche involvement frequencies between those two groups. Then we ask people, what do you think is the effect of airbags? Do they increase risk-taking? And what you see here is sort of a bar chart of their responses that goes from absolutely it's going to affect my risk-taking to not at all. And you can see that like the vast majority thinks that there's at least some impact on personal risk-taking due to the airbag. If we split this up between the owners and the non-owners, the interesting result is that the non-owners think it's going to affect them more than the owners. So maybe there's a little bit of wishful thinking in there by the owners that think it's affecting them actually less. Let's move on to the choice experiment. So I'm not going to go through the statistics of how do you sort of compare these things, but so I'm just going to focus on the main results. So for that first comparison here, the results were that owners exhibited a stronger preference to go skiing. They stayed inbounds less, and they also had a stronger preference for steeper slopes. That's again consistent with previous studies. These people are more committed and comfortable with higher risks, potentially. But so we can therefore clearly say that's not necessarily showing risk compensation, it's simply a comparison or a difference between those two groups. If we look between the normal, if we sort of look at the non-owners, once we gave them an airbag, they exhibited a stronger preference for rarely skied slopes and a stronger dislike for slopes that are skied regularly. And they suddenly had no more preference for treed runs. So they became slightly more aggressive. If we look at the owners, once we took their airbag away, they suddenly showed a significant dislike for open slopes, which they didn't show in the initial decision scenarios here. So on both sides, it sort of confirmed our hypotheses. The owners became a little bit more conservative, and the non-owners became a little bit more aggressive. But this is really just in hypothetical decision situations on a computer at home. So how does that actually relate to reality? And in our survey, we asked people for how long they've been skiing out of bounds or in the backcountry, for how long they've owned their airbag, whether they've ever been caught, and if they had been caught, whether that was before or after they bought their airbag. And so with that, we can actually calculate rates, involvement rates, with and without airbags. So if we take all of the airbag owners together, which is 153, prior to purchase, they had 20 involvements at about 1,200 exposure years. So that's just the sum of all those users together. After purchase, they had 16 involvements over about 525 years. So now we can divide those numbers and we can get rates out. So the rate would have been before purchase, it would have been 17 in 1,000 and 31 in 1,000 after the purchase. And now we can use a statistical test to actually see whether this is significantly different from each other. And it's the p-value for the geeks in here is 0.1, which is kind of a close, but it's not really statistically significant. So there seems to be a trend towards risk compensation or more involvements in the front after purchase, but I couldn't, in a scientific publication, I couldn't claim that this is scientifically different from each other. Now, if we look at the different user groups or the different risk attitude groups within, there's quite an interesting pattern. The thrill seekers, it's absolutely not significant from each other. The conservatives don't respond, but it's the power seekers where we have a significant difference in risk taking, where there was significantly more involvements after their airbag purchase. So what evidence do we now have? Huh? So we have existing general research on risk compensation that seems to indicate that there is a risk compensation. There's Terry Island's paper from 2014, and then the results from this survey, where everything seems to indicate towards that risk compensation exists. Now that we know that, the next obvious question is, does it matter? Is that a good argument for not using airbags? And in my opinion, it's not. I think if we're honest, all of our avalanche awareness education is actually enabling people to go out into the mountains and do things that they shouldn't be doing without it. And it's a personal choice about whether you want to use this knowledge or this technology to go further. Some of you might remember the tagline of the Avalanche Canada Snowmobile initiative, which was something along of the lines, I can't remember, but it was about going farther. And so what I think we need to do is to make sure that people can make informed choices about this. And so these are the recommendations that we believe come out of this study, that I think we need to continue research about the effectiveness of airbags so that we can clearly message about when they work, when they don't work. And I think it would be useful to highlight the concept of risk compensation in courses or in airbag manuals so that people who buy these things are fully aware that this is a possibility. Before I totally wrap up, just to thank all the sponsors of my program and also the organizations that helped us to sort of distribute the survey. And then if we still have time, I would be happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Pascal. It's very interesting. Your action items in the end, I come from a lot of the public realm and seeing thousands and thousands of user days a year in non-controlled environments in the backcountry. So my answer is 100% yes in this study, 100% yes. So I think an action item, and I know it's not science, but we need to find messaging to explain this to the user. I think the answer is absolutely yes, and now we have a big job ahead of us due to this tool to figure out how we explain that they're wearing something on their back that is absolutely affecting their decision making.
Yeah.
It'd be awesome if that would come from you guys.
Yeah.
Which would be great.
Couple of years.
All right, time for just one more here.
Pascal, I wonder if you could go back to your last slide there. And I've seen this, I think it was in Moses's, that one right there in the bottom line there. Could you maybe just let me know what that is, the acknowledgement?
So we're basically just trying to sort of, in the spirit of reconciliation with First Nations, we're trying to sort of acknowledge that more on whose land we are. We have that in our email signatures at the bottom of all of our emails. And we're just trying to be sort of a leader in that to sort of bring these communities together, similar along the lines of the presentation of Rachel that you saw this morning.